a really supremely expert panel of substantive insight and personal experience as well. I want them to reflect on their personal experience as well as their professional experience to the extent they're comfortable, because I think that's really valuable. We're dealing with an aspect that's not just about the black letter of the law, it's about who we are as human beings, starting with ourselves. And it's tempting in this space to say the hard work of defending the rights of asylum seekers, standing up for migrants and people who are disadvantaged, and taking a progressive stance on questions of identity and politics should be done by these experts. But actually it's the responsibility of all of us. So the upshot of this evening's discussion hopefully is we go away with a sense of what we can do in terms of citizen activists and play our role. There's a few things more important than things we're talking about. But enough from me. We'll start with some opening comments from Tasneem and move across the table and then come around to a discussion.
Thank you, Greg. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon where we've gathered here this evening and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I have a cold and I'm highly medicated, so anything I can say tonight that you don't disagree with, I will blame my medication. It's a disclaimer in advance. No, as Greg mentioned, it's, I think as a person of colour in 2019, it's a bit hard not to take the fallout of any election, both personally and professionally. There is an element to both of that, and like many of you in this room, I probably, was in a state of shock for a short time after the results came through, but then not really that much shock. And I say that because we look at Trump, we look at the United States, we look at the results of the EU election just in the last 24 hours, there has been such a strong wing to the far right and to the far left, but to the far right through Hungary, UK, Italy, France. To that extent, I mean, Modi being re-elected in India as well, given his strong nationalist views. So there is a trend in it. I think in light of that, it doesn't make the coalition's win so miraculous as inevitable. Sorry to take the shine away from that, but I really think it was kind of written on the wall in many regards. But what it does indicate is that what we've been doing for so long isn't working. And there is no room for complacency. We can't just expect others to be doing heavy lifting when it comes to advocating, to engaging with all sides of politics. And I think that's been the big takeaway that I've picked up in terms of minority communities who have been rallying against the social norm, the government of the day, and legislation that penalises and vilifies or tends to locate migrants and refugees always as the other and never part of the inclusive whole. That kind of rallying, it's not working. We need to engage, we need to tact differently, posit ourselves in a way where we're not victims, but we are survivors and we're Australians, and we need to be able to hold our head up high with integrity and say that and own it. And I think that can be confronting to do, but I think it's one of the many steps. So yeah, I think we need to change tact. I think we need to engage more without compromising our beliefs. In terms of the impact immediately, I know with the refugee communities it's been really stark. I'm sure David probably would speak to the number of refugees on offshore detention who've tried to commit suicide in the last few days, simply in reaction to the low morale. I think it's been a very strong message. I think the sense that if the leadership actually felt they weren't going to win, for a small time there, that would have, I analysed that and I thought, well, that probably meant to them at one point, well, maybe we didn't do things right, we should have listened to the base more, we should have done things differently. But given that they won, I think it's going to make our job even harder, because in a way they've been vindicated, when in fact the polls indicated a very different message. Anyway, I'll pass it on to Lydia.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for having me, and Greg for inviting me here, being hosted by Deacon. This issue is really very important to me personally because I'm a person who's a migrant twice over. I first migrated to the United States when I was very young from Egypt back in the late 80s, and one of the reasons why we migrated to the US is that we were a religious minority in Egypt, a Coptic Christian minority there, and there were, aside from a lot of economic difficulties and stuff, there was a lot of discrimination against religious minorities in that country. And then I migrated once again here to Australia for very different reasons, but I'm sympathetic, and it's an issue about migration and identity, even though I'm not a refugee per se, that affects me personally, but I feel it's also an issue that is collectively critical to a country based on migration like Australia is. I think it gets to the heart of what kind of nation we are and what kind of nation we want to be. I think if you take a look at it, and if you ask a lot of Australians, despite some hiccups here and there, people will say that migration is a net benefit to Australia. This country has benefited enormously from migrants, whether it's through their labor, their talents, the food, the music, their values. You know, they've brought an enormous amount to this country. You know, I hear stories from my in-laws when they first came to Australia in the late 60s, from the Middle East, from Italy, from Greece, you know, and I talked to them and their friends. And when they first came here, they said they could only buy their olive oil from the chemist. If they ate spaghetti, you know, people would make fun of them for eating worms for dinner. And now, can you imagine not having olive oil and gorging on pasta here in this country? I mean, it's just one of the very, maybe superficial ways that migrants make us all better, but it's certainly one of those things. And aside from that, migrants have put an enormous economic benefit to this country. It has allowed for this uninterrupted, unprecedented growth, economic growth in Australia. Without migration, the economic miracle of Australia, with no recession and not going into you know, the depths after the Great Recession in 2008 that Australia avoided, that was due to migration, largely. There was a report by Treasury and Home Affairs in 2018, and it says that migration makes Australians wealthier, and the annual permanent intake adds 1 percentage point to GDP per year. So over the span of 30 years, that adds about $7 billion to our economy. So when we're talking about the benefits of migration, we have to look at it holistically and to understand the very intricate ways that migration has helped and strained our economy in certain aspects, but certainly this economic growth, unprecedented economic growth in Australia would not have been possible. I'll just say one more thing before I pass it along to the other panelists and open it up for discussion. I'm a national security professional by background and by training, so I tend to take a look at things from a security lens. But one of the things I've been urging people to do when it comes to migration and immigration policy is actually, you know, pull the brakes a little bit in terms of how we take a look at security with migration. I feel like the migration and immigration issue has been overly securitized in ways that it hasn't been in decades prior. I think since 9/11 and certainly since 2011, the securitization of migration policy has distorted how we as a society look at it and how politicians take a look at this issue. And I'd make the last point as well with refugees. We need to broaden our view when it comes to the issue of refugees. And when I say that is, I think we're looking at it too myopically in terms of our national policy toward refugees. The refugee issue is a global issue. If you take a look at all of the refugees at this point in time, we have about 25 million refugees. These are UN statistics, which is not considering displaced people. It's about 68.5 million displaced people around the world. This is the largest number of displaced people on record. 57% of those come from 3 countries: South Sudan, Syria, Afghanistan. If you add 2 more countries, Myanmar and Somalia, that's 68% of all refugees. So clearly, this is an issue of building sustainable peace and conflict resolution in those countries. And dealing with the refugee flows, these global refugees flows, not just through our national policies, but as a matter of international policy. So I'll leave it at there and leave my other comments for the discussion aside.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight. I'm really delighted to participate in such a diverse panel, particularly during Reconciliation Week. I think this is really a good timing and a good forum to discuss inclusive politics, which I think is really the core issue that we have to start putting to the front these days. This is not just an isolated or local problem that we experience in Australia. This is a global problem that has to start from local initiatives, but then flow to everywhere else. And this is really ultimately about inclusive politics. I mean, I know the title our panel is identity politics, and I think that the opposite of this is thinking about what we can do more to change local attitudes and to change, the policies based on those types of local politics. Now, I'm a third-generation migrant, refugee. My grandparents escaped Nazi Germany in beginning of Second World War, and their experiences really kind of motivated and influenced a lot the way that I look at these issues. I look at it from the perspective of someone who has kind of strong refugee experiences in the family. Of course, I'm not a refugee myself, but I have been a migrant in the US for 7 years. I'm a migrant here in Australia now. And I'm a person that feels alien in his home country, which is Israel for me. And so I've experienced different types of inclusivity and isolation in different places. And so all these types of experiences really motivate the way I look at those problems and the solution that we can offer. I've also had some very kind of diverse experiences, professional experiences. So as Greg mentioned, I've served 5 years in the military. Perhaps, I think, looking back, I wouldn't have volunteered to those extra years today, but when you are a part of a large institution, it's often really difficult to see reality beyond your, the boundaries of your institution. And that's one of the things that I investigate in my own research. I look at organizational biases in regard to all kinds of fact-finding processes. So after my 5 years in the military, I've also spent 5 years in the High Court of Israel working on international law matters, issues regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then after I left the courts, it was just another institution with all its limitations. I worked as a human rights lawyer for a while. I worked as the chief prosecutor officer in a while. And then all those organizations, I just felt so kind of compartmentalized that I had to just break free and went to Stanford to complete my PhD in law and politics. And perhaps it would be easier to explain my research using a quote. So the quote goes like this: "I hate taking these people. I guarantee you they're bad. That is why they're in prison right now." Anyone want to guess who said that and to whom? Yes? Yeah, it was Trump to Turnbull exactly 2 years ago after Trump was elected. And Turnbull tried to, convince him to, fulfill the U.S., the Obama administration promises to take some of the refugees that Australia keeps, and it's like offshore processing. And so, I was reading this, it was a WikiLeaks conversation, and I was looking at this. I hate taking these people. I guarantee you they're bad. That is why they're in prison. Well, obviously there is not a shred of truth in any of this statement, right? But it didn't really matter. And if you look at the how this conversation continued, well, Turnbull tried to explain, no, you got this wrong. These are not bad people at all, right? They're good. I mean, we only, keep them there because, we don't want to take them in. And then, Trump says, well, if they're so good, then why don't you take them? And, it kind of brings this conversation to a dead end at some point. But this really, so I've thought a lot about this conversation and what it really says. And that kind of opened or kind of was partly what motivated me to conduct research on the way that legal labels influence how people form their attitudes about refugees, and the way that particular labels like illegals, like criminals, terrorists, all these types of labels that people like the President of the United States are using to label refugees, are they really kind of infusing those false beliefs that we see so frequently in many societies, not just in Australia, but definitely here too. And so I field survey experiments that basically measure how different types of legal labels kind of influence how people think about refugees and how people think about immigration policies more broadly. And basically, one of the things that I argue, and perhaps we can disagree on that later or not, is that really some of the human rights discourse around refugees, basically saying that refugees have rights for this or that, is sometimes counterproductive, because it then infuses the conversation of it's my right against your right, and people start holding more, negative attitudes, thinking no, it's not that. We're not speaking now in humanitarian terms. We're not talking about this in all kinds of, we are being, good Samaritans or just good people or helping humanity. No, now this is a legal battle, and in legal battles you have two sides, and if one wins, the other loses, and I don't want to be on the losing side. And so these are the types of issues that I test and measure in different contexts, in Australia, in the US, and in Israel. And I'll be happy to talk more about this later in the Q&A.
In modern Australian history, there is a deep humanitarian strain. You may have forgotten about that. But it's actually one which includes, amongst many other things, the fact that the historical record shows this, that since the Second World War, Australia has resettled over 800,000 refugees and humanitarian entrants. We have all benefited immeasurably from this. So has my family. I share a similar experience in one sense, that very personally and directly, and that is my grandparents, Kate and Henry, were fortunate to escape Europe in the 1930s during the Second World War, and were granted refugee status here. They were granted status as refugees here, and most of their family, my ancestors, met violent deaths. They escaped, and I really owe my existence in large part to their courage and good fortune, really, to find refuge here and to create lives of safety, to rebuild their lives. And I'm sure that there are others in this room that have similar histories. And one of the fundamental facts, which I think we've lost sight of, is, in many respects, is how much we have benefited immeasurably from this. How much more vibrant, how much stronger and richer we are for this history, this modern Australian history. And it also includes this history, something which I think is central in the question that we're asked to address at the beginning, and that is the challenges and opportunities that faces as a nation, if I can reframe that, rather than face the Morrison government, that we face as a nation. And I might just start with a very simple point, and that is we signed up to the Refugees Convention in 1954. With the sixth country in the world, the first outside Europe. In fact, our signature to the convention, the Refugees Convention, activated it. It needed 6 signatures to actually be activated. So that's what I'm talking about too, as another part of the golden threads, really, about modern Australian history. And in signing up, we made a sacrosanct promise, and it was to protect and defend refugees, to welcome, to embrace, to help, not to harm. And I would have to say in recent times that historical promise has been betrayed. That sacrosanct promise has been betrayed. The question is no longer, as it was some time ago, are we at risk as a nation of violating obligations that we owe to people seeking refuge? I think the question shifted to, are any of the policies, are any of the actions taken by successive governments capable of meeting those obligations? What has happened in the last 20 years, with some brief exceptions, is that the Australian parliaments have constructed the harshest and most comprehensive anti-asylum seeker system in the industrialised world. We have employed our navy to repel innocent and vulnerable people seeking our help. We have then cast those people into exile on Nauru and Manus into what is human warehousing. It's not offshore processing, so-called. It's actually human warehousing and indefinite detention. We have for thousands, in fact tens of thousands of people who weren't sent there but remained in Australia, having come by boat. We have given them only temporary protection where they have to renew it every few years, as if they have to reprove they're a refugee every 3 years. People living in our community, fleeing from places like Afghanistan, from Syria, from Iraq, Iran and Sri Lanka, and on it goes, from horrendous and brutal abuse and tyranny. We have consigned them to a twilight world within our community living with us, a cycle of uncertainty which is a second wave of suffering. So going back to the commitment, the promise to help not to harm, instead, once again, the policy at its heart for people fleeing from harm has inflicted further harm. That's the heart of it. And so that's the question in a way, the central question in this area. How can we as a nation get back to a position, return to a position where the central element of our response is one of helping, not harming, of protecting, not punishing. I think that a central question this evening, which is possible, I'd be keen to explore if others are, is another question that I think hangs heavily over our nation, and that is whatever mandate may be claimed by politicians for stopping the boats, whatever mandate may be claimed, in truth, I would argue there has never been a mandate to mistreat people in this way. It has become one of the great national falsehoods. Have Australians really, has Australia en masse across the country woken up each day hoping for children to be sent to Nauru to be crushed, to experience what may well be lifelong damage? I would argue not so. And so how do we reconcile this as a nation is a question. There are policies which we can get into later on, but I don't think we need to catalogue all of the policies that need change. But again, challenges for our nation at the moment: the evacuation of all people suffering on Nauru and Manus Island, an end to indefinite detention in our country, which to my mind is actually, in explaining this question with this deep humanitarian strain, how have we become so cruel as a nation to asylum seekers? We need to confront that question. But as part of it, one of the various issues that I think we have to confront is that for nearing 3 decades, it's not far off, we have actually had laws which have been enacted on a mass scale to incarcerate, that is indefinitely incarcerate, innocent people seeking our help. Children, women, men, families, often for years on end. To my mind, I've come to think that policy has become central to many of the other harmful policies. You put very simply, if you can do that to people, you can pretty much do anything. That opens up the dark path to Nauru and Manus, in my view. So I think that's a central challenge. And also temporary protection. We can come back to that later. A couple of observations before we move to the discussion. I think that one of the great challenges actually is whether our country can move back to a position which, again, we may have forgotten, and that was an era where this issue of asylum and migration was not politicised. There was bipartisanship, and I think it's a critical challenge for the nation, really, because what happened with the Tampa episode, the Tampa event in 2001, was that effectively bipartisanship on these issues, which have been so central to helping, not harming people seeking our help, was shunned and destroyed. And what we saw instead was that asylum policy became all of a sudden politicised. It became a political football. It became an arena of political opportunism, and we have simply been mired in that ever since, in a politics which really has, with rare exception, been a contest between the major political parties over who can be harsher toward vulnerable people seeking our help. I mean, that's been the political construct. Together with a binary, and this is another issue which perhaps we can explore tonight, a binary, there's been the creation of binary. We all know in this room, as soon as you create a binary on these issues, you know which direction it's going to head, right? The binary in this country has been, you are either, on one end, you are a bleeding heart who believes in open borders, letting everyone in, a free-for-all, effectively, or on the other hand, you're someone that says everyone should be blocked from coming here, and you're sort of a redneck, a bigot, or a warlord of darkness, you know. And there's nothing in between, really. What we haven't had in this country, because of the politicisation and other dynamics with it, we haven't had a serious, proper national dialogue on alternatives to this situation, and we need it desperately. And as part of that, I make a plea too, that as part of it, that we must engage with one of the drivers of deterrence policy, which underpins a lot of this, and that is the fear and anxiety, the genuine fear and anxiety that many people in this country have toward people coming informally to this country, including by boat. It's not to succumb to that fear in any way, but to engage with it as part of that conversation, instead of dismissing people who have fears and anxieties as being rednecks, bigots or warlords of darkness, but to actually engage in a proper dialogue over these issues in order to frame a policy which is fair, humane, just and decent, which actually reflects the kind of society that we want to live in, dream of and defend. So there's some opening comments. Probably the only other thing that I would like to say as part of it is one final point. We're also sort of asked to address, perhaps what at a state, local government level, or a community level needs to be done. I think one note, and it's just very fresh, is the state government have just announced, for example, that despite the federal government effectively stripping people of basic supports in the community across the country, people seeking asylum, stripping them of basic supports, housing, income, and psychosocial supports, etc., and leaving many people at risk of serious destitution in our community because of it. It shows, there's been a recent announcement by the state government that it will step in and provide some emergency relief and funding, and that can only be welcome. And I say that, of course, in a completely non-political way. It's to acknowledge that that state governments, local governments, and us, we can do something about these things. And part of it is, change does not come through supernatural forces, as we know. It comes through political and public will, people acting on these things. So my final point would be, and we can talk again a little bit more about this, about what we can do, but the government has consigned tens of thousands of people to uncertainty on TPVs, living in limbo with our community, potentially for the rest of their lives, because they're unlikely to ever be able to return. And in doing so, they've consigned them to a form of marginalisation within our community. It's a punitive policy, it's deliberately punitive, it's conscious, calculated cruelty, it's designed to shut people out, to marginalise them, but they're living with us. People are living with us in our community who desperately are seeking, desperately sought protection and are seeking to be included in our community, in the life of our communities. So, what an incredible act of civil disobedience to embrace people in this situation. It doesn't just take governments to do so. In so many ways, there is an ability to embrace, to welcome, to extend a hand of help, and inclusion.
Thank you all. Those are brilliant opening statements. I wish we had hours and hours to unpack things, but I'm going to have to try and move things along quickly. Let's deal with this issue of how we respond to people coming seeking asylum, whether by boat or by air. Of course, the vast majority come by air. But let's go to another issue. David mentioned 2001, the Tampa, the Norwegian freighter that picked up Tamil asylum seekers, and then of course we had the 9/11 incident, the terror attack, and we had John Howard winning an unwinnable election. He didn't say it was a miracle, but that's another story. The mechanics of it were pretty clear. It was the politics of fear, and so it was dubbed by David Marr a dark victory. And in a weird kind of sad way, that was the end, as David said, of a bipartisan approach to these issues. We got back to bipartisanship by Labor and Liberals both agreeing that we should demonise people coming by boat. So the justification for this inhumane behaviour is that, well, firstly, they represent a threat to national security, and secondly, it's a wicked problem. There's no good solution, so we've got to break the model of people smugglers and stop people dying at sea. So let's take those two issues first. I'll go to Lydia and then to Cherie to look at the national security argument. Is there a national security? The reason for doing this is because we need to get the facts clear. We're going back to local, state, federal government and trying to lobby for change. Well, as David said, there's a tendency to say either you're a bleeding heart or you're hard. But there are good people across different political parties who do want to deal with these issues. We need to make it more possible for them to do the right thing. So let's deal with this issue of national security. Lydia?
Sure. Hello. Well, first, I would just take issue with the fact that lumping all of the political parties together and saying, well, they just have the same policies on this issue.
No,
I think there are differences between Labour and Liberal and Green and others and stuff. And I think with all of this, always the devil is in the details. So I'll just put that point out there. Certainly that infamous line by John Howard, "We decide who comes into this country," and the manner in which they come, I think that's one of the things that nobody really will ever forget. It's like this brilliant line that really cut to the core of it, and that really resonated, I think, with a lot of people, particularly after 9/11. But I'll go back to kind of my earlier comment about how this issue has been overly securitized. I still do believe that, but I will also say that there are not zero security concerns either. There are some security concerns. The people smuggling trade is a terrible trade. People die on the high seas. There are people, these people smugglers take advantage of people in dire situations, and we have to work toward pushing against that trade. The question is how can we do it without being so punitive to the people who are actually seeking help? And I feel like the governments Australian governments, since that time, we've got to this point where, those Chinese finger trap things, where you put your finger in it and then you pull too much one way. If we pull too much on being overly, focused on security, we still get stuck. And we pull the other way, if you stop the turnbacks, for example, or you don't do the offshore detention, then it gets to a flow of people and the reinvigoration of the people smuggling trade. So it's a tricky issue. How do we stop the people smuggling trade? How do we instill some level of screening of people coming into the country, which I think most reasonable people will agree is necessary. The problem, though, with a lot of people who are seeking asylum and refugees is they don't have the necessary documents with them. They're often fleeing dire situations where they're not going to maybe think to get their passport and their birth certificate and other documentation to prove that they're asylum seekers. And so that's one of the reasons why you have long detentions when you do offshore processing. It's not the only reason, but one of the reasons for it. So I think we just need to be cognizant of some of these details when we talk about that issue. But certainly there has been, it seems to me, an over-securitization of this issue. And that's why many times we feel stuck with this issue. Because I don't think Australian society is a cruel society overall. But there is an argument to be made to do it in fairness, to benefit our entire society, and to keep some security checks in place.
Thank you, Lydia. Cherie, you've worked on human rights and national security issues. You advised the Supreme Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. You've looked through these things for a very long period of time. What do you say about the argument that national security is threatened by people arriving seeking asylum, particularly by sea?
Well, obviously this is just another fake argument because we have actually data, right? And all the data out there demonstrates without any, hesitation that there are no kind of, higher percentage of either security threats or crime generally among refugee communities. So typically what most studies demonstrate is that we have less crime and less security threats stemming from refugee communities than other communities, including people that come on visa, including what we call homegrown terrorism, what we call other domestic communities. So I mean, just kind of debunking this on the factual side of things. Well, the data shows that it's not a real threat. Of course, that when we look at refugees, we don't want to have even a single one that would, endanger our security, which is probably then the argument, right? They don't have a right to be here, so we would, we won't take the risk. Now, that also has a very, simple answer. You can check, right? So it's possible to have, all those, security checks that governments are really fabulous in doing. And it can take some time, sure, but I think refugees and refugees communities would be happy to wait a couple of months and have those checks completed, which is absolutely possible. I mean, when I moved to the U.S., my husband is a chemist, is a scientist, and for the U.S., if you are a chemist from the Middle East, then you have to go through lots of screening and processing. Of course, the fact that Stanford was sponsoring us did not matter. We actually had to wait for weeks until they completed their security checks, making sure that he's not going to use his chemistry skills for illegal purposes. But this is possible. Sometimes when you come from third world countries or countries that suffer from violence and conflict, it may take longer, it can be more complicated, but it's possible. The amount of information that our society has today is really, it's unimaginable. We know everything. The NSA is listening to everything that we say, to everything that we type in Google, to everything that we communicate or do in so many different ways. And so, I mean, the whole security argument is really just kind of a veil of smoke, because the data is out there. It's possible to check it, and it's possible to reach some findings within a reasonable amount of time. So just on the factual of this is really an argument that I think is quite weak. I also want to say that with regard to the Howard government in particular, and generally, and it's not just something that's particularly unique to Australia, but when we see those types of arguments and that then leads or justify exclusionary policies, well, research also shows that this is government-led. So governments like to tell us, well, this is based on public opinion, we do what the public wants us to do, but this is just not true, because studies around the world, in Europe and here in Australia, demonstrate that basically this starts with the politicians rather than elsewhere externally to those politics that they were set to promote anyways. And so that's about where it comes from. And just a little anecdote to finish, because I do work a lot on these issues in Israel, where I come from. And it's really interesting, because anywhere else around the world, what we see when we discuss, refugees is really the label that I mentioned as illegals, right? They're illegals, they come illegally. And this is the kind of what you would see generally as kind of this negative attribute towards refugees. Now, in Israel, it's really interesting, because when Palestine was ruled by the British Mandate before Israel was founded, illegals was a positive term that the Jewish community in Israel used to term those illegals, German or European refugees that try to infiltrate into British Palestine, British mandated Palestine. And so in Israel, it wouldn't be an appropriate term to use to kind of cast this negative aspects towards refugees. So in Israel, instead, there was this new legislation that termed illegal immigrants as infiltrators. And why is that? That was a law that was passed really early on in the 50s, just after Israel was founded, in order to kind of prevent people or Palestinians and people from the neighboring Arab countries to enter into Israel. And so the term infiltrators was really unanimous in Israel to a security threat. These were like the Arabs that wants to destroy Israel. And so we have the law against infiltration. And when we now had these waves in Israel, the recent waves of African refugees, then this law was evoked because the illegals know these are the deserving Jewish refugees that had to escape Germany. Those who come now from Africa, they're infiltrators, which then for Israel is really synonymous with a security threat. So it's just kind of an anecdote about how these arguments then work in different societies based on different cultural aspects and labels.
Thank you, David.
I might, in particular, respond to some of Lydia's comments, if I may, and I'll try and just sort of be fairly brief. But I do want to pick up on a point about the issue of threat, of security threat, and I think it can be answered very simply on two levels. One is that in 2001, during the Howard period and during the Tampa crisis, what we saw come into the sort of effectively into the politics and the public imagination, I guess, was a characterisation of people. It was really 433, mainly Afghan men, Afghan Hazaras, we should remember, on a boat seeking asylum in Australia, fleeing from the Taliban, from the cruelty of the Taliban. And what they were characterised as was people not with problems, but people who were a problem. They were characterised as people not fleeing, not threatened, but people who posed a threat. Now, the fact is that the head of the head of ASIO, our intelligence agency, the head of ASIO, not long ago, gave evidence in a parliamentary setting. Once again, not for the first time, that a head of intelligence in our country has completely and totally dismissed the suggestion that there is evidence that people coming to Australia seeking asylum in any significant sense pose a security threat to the country. What he once again repeated was that there is simply no evidence that people seeking asylum coming to this country pose a significant threat. Rather, he made it clear that the evidence is that such a threat is negligible. Okay, so that's the fact. Point two, and that is just picking up on the infamous haunting words of the former Prime Minister John Howard during the Tampa crisis, that we will decide who comes to this country and in what circumstances, which Lydia referred to. Really what that was doing was channeling an aspect, I think, which is one of the things we have to confront if we are to change things in this country. And I wouldn't describe it as brilliant, but rather I would describe it as very clever. What it was also doing was it epitomised a way of thinking in this country, which I think has been deep in the reason for why we have as a country become so cruel to asylum seekers, which is quite a different point to Lydia, what you said, and that is I think as a nation we have become cruel in our policies and our approach. I don't think we're a cruel society, but I think our approach is demonstrably cruel to asylum seekers. What I think it channeled was something we needed to confront. That famous quote of John Howard's. What it channeled was an aspect of the White Australia policy, but it's an aspect it's not the racist aspect, the racial exclusion. It's another aspect, which is about an idea that we can, an extreme, almost absolutist sense of immigration control, that not one person can be permitted to come to this country without authorisation, which frankly we've got used to as a way of thinking, and it's deep in the bureaucratic culture, deep in the political culture. It's a most unusual and sort of a most unusual idea for most nations in the world, this idea that it's almost this absolutist form of control, but it's dominant in our thinking. And I think it's something that we need to confront as a nation. I want to come to the next point about Lydia, and I hope I'm getting right. I hope I'm characterising what you said correctly. Well, we can come back to that, but what I took you as saying that there was a question about how we push against the manipulative, the exploitative, the people smuggler trade without doing harm to people as much as we are. I hope I've characterised it. I would put the question quite differently, and I think we need to frame it quite differently to that. I think the first question is, how do we, rather than what we've seen, and that is prioritise the protection of borders over the protection of people, I would think that the question is, how do we prioritise the protection of people over the protection of borders? The dominant question is, how do we prioritise the protection of people within the obvious need for a government to actually regulate borders. And I would say as part of that, the fundamental and overarching question is, how do we have a policy with human dignity and humanitarian outcomes at its heart, rather than defaulting to deterrence and detention strategy? So how do we meet our obligations that we've signed up to internationally, strike the right balance which at its heart focuses on the plight of people seeking asylum, and in particular in the Asia-Pacific region? How do we mitigate harm and improve protection for people? That's the central question. It's not to deny that that governments need to manage borders, that needs to be part of it, and indeed sovereignty is part of it, but not at the expense of the protection of people in the way that we've seen. And I think that really where that needs to head, that conversation, is the development, building a cooperative framework. If Australia is to continue to turn back boats, and there's bipartisanship on this, and also clearly a public sentiment, a public attitude in support of that, the question becomes, what do we do? If we're going to block people accessing asylum in Australia, what are we going to do about those people blocked? Because we know there are millions of people who will be searching for protection within our region. What do we do in the Asia Pacific for millions of people fleeing war and persecution? And instead of spending billions of dollars on the misery of offshore processing, to invest in working with countries in the region, Malaysia, Indonesia, and beyond, so that we share the responsibility for rescuing, processing fairly, humanely hosting, and resettling refugees. Because for far too long, Australia has instead embarked upon a focus on the people smuggling trade, on protecting the borders, and what's happened is that is a deflected responsibility onto other nations in the region. It's also, as part of that, destabilised, not stabilised the situations of people, and therefore has ultimately shirked our responsibilities to people who we're duty bound to protect. So I think that there's some central issues. The final point that I wanted to make, if I can, is really, and I have to really, with all due respect, challenge you fundamentally on the point of the reason why people have been in offshore detention for so long is because they didn't bring documents. The way, and I've been doing this work for 20 years, providing legal assistance with a team for people seeking asylum. The reason why people have been left in prolonged offshore detention is because the Australian government has funded to the tune of billions of dollars a policy to leave them there in prolonged detention as a form of deterrence and beyond, and political symbolism and beyond. Ordinarily processing, and it's just a standard and fundamental principle in the processing of refugee claims, is that arguably most people seeking asylum who flee don't have all the documentation that you might hope for. And that's part of the refugee experience, it's integral to it. And therefore the processing of asylum claims is predicated, ordinarily proceeds on that understanding, and therefore applies a principle which is to examine people's claims and testimony against evidence that about their country situation, other forms of evidence, accepting that many people, if most, won't have that documentation, and then having to make judgments upon those claims upon proper examination, including affording the benefit of the doubt where appropriate. So I don't think that's the reason why people have been left languishing.
Yeah, look, I think I'm in error for setting Lydia up with playing devil's advocate and then not getting a chance to properly present her position. So I'll get either of you to respond to David, and then those important questions that David's asked us to respond to, I'll get Tasneem to answer. Yeah, all those simple questions. I can see we've made a slight technical mistake tonight. We should have allocated another 2 hours for discussion. Instead we have 20 minutes, so we'll do our best. But Lydia,
I'll be very brief because I don't want this to turn into a two-way debate. I know a lot of people have other things to say, but I'll just to clarify a couple of the points that I made. I mean, I'm not going to be an advocate of the current detention policies. I don't think they're correct, so I'm not going to, that's not the position I'm taking with that one. In terms of the documentation issues, I'll certainly defer to you since you've been working on this for a particular case since on a long time. But I know personally and anecdotally that it is one issue among all of it. It is not the only one. I think that you're correct to say that it is brought of a harder punitive measure, a push. But when you talk about the people smuggling trade, if we do have a duty to protect, we must also protect from that as well. And I'll just refer quickly back to some of the comments I made in the earlier portion of it, is that instead of looking at it myopically in terms of our national, what we have to do nationally, and in terms of protecting the borders, about deciding who comes and who doesn't and that kind of thing, we really do need to take a look at this, not only regionally but internationally. I mean, the majority of refugees that are and displaced people are going to developing countries rather than countries like Australia or even Europe or the United States. The countries that have taken the most refugees are countries like Lebanon and Jordan. And so we have to think broadly, right, about how do we assist these countries, developing countries, who have far less resources than we do, help with that. How are we going to take a look at conflict resolution, sustainable peace in these countries? So I get a little bit frustrated when we talk about this issue in Australia and in Europe and in the United States, within Western countries. We take a look at it with so much self-interest, so much like this myopic view about that, when this is really a global problem and we have to take a look at it. Otherwise, these issues are going to continue to be politicized, they're going to continue to cause wedges within our own societies. And if we don't start taking a look at that more broadly, and kind of, get our heads out of it a little bit, then this issue is going to continue for most.
thank you. Tasneem, you've been waiting very patiently, and you'll have a long
Which is good and bad.
period of time. We're not just waiting to answer the questions, but also dealing with the Australian public. How do we persuade the Australian public about these issues?
Okay, I'll try and come back to that. Well, simply, as I think as David alluded to, we need to start humanising these refugees and not weaponising them. And it's been a very political expedient tool that has won many a federal election to fearmonger and to race bait. It has worked really, really well, and I'm so delighted that it didn't work in our state election when the opposition was trying to incite this African gang mentality, and which again fell flat on its face because the rhetoric was exposed for what it was and the evidence did not support what they were saying. So that's a classic case of fact over fiction. So yeah, humanise them. And I remember being part of a briefing committee that met with then Minister for Citizenship when they were talking about revisiting the chart of what it meant to be an Australian, the pledge. And there was a very clear intent to conflate national security with citizenship as if they were the same thing. So that way anyone coming into Australia would understand that we don't have Sharia. And I'm like, on what planet would that be a logical part of, allegiance to Australian values? So there was a very clear and discerning attempt there to conflate fear of others, and it was a very clearly Islamophobic agenda, and I won't pretend that it was anything less, that they were trying to pass through this charter which they wanted new migrants to sign on, which would have been easy if you weren't even a Muslim. You think, well, of course I don't want Sharia, I'm not going to do that. But there was also the assumption that that's what refugees were trying to do. That's what asylum seekers were trying to do. They were trying to come in with this very aggressive agenda, which has not been substantiated by the facts. And I think that keeps on coming up. But we keep on going back to this division of us and them, and it sells, it magnifies, and it detracts from the other issues. And when something as clear as the number of women being killed in this country by intimate partners is 24 so far this year and counting, when that figure and the perpetrators of that are the real issue, a domestic threat to this country, and not someone who is currently holed up in Narrow Manus Island and has been there for 4.5 years, we know that the propaganda machine is working overtime. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. I'm going to stand up now and collect some questions from the floor, because I did promise you a chance to do that, and I've noticed how quickly time goes by. So let me go to the lectern, and I'll take a bunch of questions together, and then we'll get the panel to answer them together. Okay, I've seen a few hands. I think, okay, Max over there. Just I'll get the microphone to you. Just a very quick framing of the question. We'll back with you.
My question, in essence, is about the role of the criminal law, because the mistreatment offshore and onshore is a criminal offence under workplace law, because all Commonwealth immigration centres are workplaces, and the people in charge have a duty under health and safety to protect proactively and preventatively risks to their health. So my question is, and there's a letter that's gone around that seeks a prosecution in relation to a Manus death. My question, I suppose, principally to the two lawyers, this end, is there a role for criminal prosecutions to shift government behaviour in relation to those in detention?
Thank you. Just put your hands up again, please. Sorry, you've got the mic, Patrick. We'll take a question over here from this gentleman, and then we'll go to the other end of the room.
Hi, my name's Tim. In the lead up to the election, we had the horror and shock of what happened in Christchurch, which seemed to stop the Liberals in their track in, again, weaponising the issue. And then we basically, as far as I know, didn't hear anything about it, and of course Labor wasn't going to mention anything about this policy area. So I'm just wondering, to get the panel's comment on whether there might be a change in the public discourse, an ongoing, this is an opportunity for the discourse to change in an ongoing way.
Thank you. And there's a question over here, yes, and we'll go back to the other end of the room.
I just wanted to pick up on the notion of bipartisanship, which David mentioned a number of times, and wanted to ask the panel members if they still believe it's relevant, because in my view, bipartisanship is one of the great falsehoods of Australian politics. It hasn't been good for the country. I don't know if everyone realises, but in the recent elections, 80% of the voting population voted for parties that are in favour of both turnbacks and offshore detention. 80%. And that includes, of course, the party that was hoping to win power and didn't. So what bipartisanship has led us after many, many years, and starting with Tampa, is a meeting at the lowest common denominator where we meet in the bonds of cruelty, but not in the purpose of helping rather than harming. So my question is, how can we overcome this fiction of bipartisanship so that opposition starts doing what it's meant to be doing in the parliament, as opposed to tagging on to everything that's proposed by the government and trying to make their bad laws slightly better? How about they actually start doing what they are there to do, which is to oppose and come up with their own propositions? And I would like to just hear what the panel thinks about that.
Thank you. We'll just take two more questions before we move on. There's two people down the end waiting, and we'll take these questions, then we'll go to the panel. We won't have time to unpack all of these excellent questions, but we'll address them.
Okay, so my question is, if one of the arguments about the offshore asylum seekers that they don't have proper documents, what are the reasons, and my question is to the lawyers here, what are the reasons for the delays in onshore processing? Refugees, proper refugees who come to Australia and stay years, with indefinite answer. What do you think are the reasons? Like, how can we improve that? Because these are marginalised people in our society. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, and we'll move to the panel.
Hi. So I've got a question, first related to the refugee policy, and the second is identity politics. With regards to refugee policy, what's happening with the Bali process? And talking about identity politics and inclusivity, what are your thoughts on the prevalence of gatekeeping in the and racial capitalism in the social justice space? Thanks.
Thank you. Look, these are excellent questions. There are many more, I'm sure. As I said, we made a technical mistake. We should have allocated 2 more hours. We didn't. It's not possible with this location. So to try and do some justice to those issues, I'm going to just move down the table, starting with Tasneem, then Lydia and Shereen and David, and letting them pick up the particular issues that they want to address. We won't be doing, as I said, justice to your questions, but at least we can begin to engage with them and leave you with some provocative issues to mull over and think of. I want you to think about where we go next, personally, in terms of activism and what we do to make a change.
Can you give me one of the questions?
Okay, well, let me put you that last thing I was framing, Tasneem, which is what should we be doing in this space? What do we all in this room, what can we do to change what's happening? Because there's injustices, there's the playing of politics with people's anxieties, there's the fact that once you're in opposition, you're scared to step out of line on this, others you're against the government. How do we educate the public to get behind pushing for policy reform and change?
Well, I think one of the questions about bipartisanship is and I would argue that. I'm sorry. Yeah, the issue on bipartisanship more or less addressed that, I think, to some extent, and I would be running behind strengthening the voice of opposition so that they, maybe this is utopic, but I'm usually quite cynical, but I would like to think that the results of this last election means that they really have to lift their bootstraps up, and they really do need to take a strong position and not be oscillating between where they think they might stand and where they actually stand, and show leadership. I don't think we've seen leadership, we've seen more of a reactionary posturing, and I think there's a big difference there. And I believe true leadership would actually take a firm stand on a humanitarian, and going back to what David discussed very early in this evening, is going back to that humanitarian cause and drive that defined what migration meant. And there's an interesting statistic that came recently from the Scanlon Foundation just last year that showed of who they polled that overwhelmingly Australians have a very positive attitude towards multiculturalism, but a lot more weary about migration. And I thought that was an interesting distinction, because it meant that effectively what you're ending up with is they like the culture of the people, but not the people of the culture. And I think when that happens, it makes functional transitioning and integration quite difficult. The optics are great, but the actual on-the-ground realities are intractable, because people only like things to go so far. So real leadership is about acknowledging and embracing the contributions that we know multiculturalism through migration has achieved, and demonstrating that and wearing it. And that can be as simplistic as a diverse leadership cabinet, and not just gender diverse, but trans, it's culturally, linguistically diverse, it's ableism, it's all of those different aspects and levels of diversity which reflect what Australia looks like in 2019 and not in 1914. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'll just say 2 quick comments. One on the bipartisanship issue and the ones you raise in Christchurch, because I think the 2 lawyers have the bulk of the wisdom to share with us on these questions. On the bipartisanship issue, I think what we're seeing is really a lack of a trust and a lack of and an increase in frustration with both major parties across the board. I think on this issue, on whatever side you fall, and on many other issues. And I think what that's done is it's driven an unprecedented number of people to vote for minor parties to signal that frustration. But that's a double-edged sword, because it has taken away some ability and stability of the major parties perhaps to move forward in both the migration issue and the refugee issue, along with some of the other ones. So I'll just make that tangential point related to it. And then with Christchurch, just because this is an area that's a bit more in my wheelhouse when dealing with terrorism. I've been working a lot with law enforcement in the United States and have been for a long time. And when you speak to law enforcement, whether in the United States or Australia and elsewhere, they will tell you categorically that the rise of right-wing extremism has been on the rise for a long time. And we've known that as law enforcement and intelligence professionals, and now I think the perception of it in the public and in the media and perhaps in politics has caught up with what the security professionals have known. And I think Christchurch made a huge shift in how we talk about terrorism. It's not just a brown people problem, it's not just a Muslim problem, it's a problem of extremism across the board.
Okay, so I'll also add a few comments regarding to the bipartisanship, but they also relate to some of the other questions as well. So I think when I first arrived to Australia and started learning about, the kind of refugee and migration politics around here, I was just shocked realizing that Australia is such, a hospitable country to refugees generally, right? So Australia takes part in the UN resettlement program. So tens of thousands of refugees are being resettled in Australia every year according to international agreements, and that's just lovely. But then when people that are actually right now escaping danger and mortal danger, no, we're shutting the doors. And to me, it was just this kind of shocking realization that, when they're already safe, somewhere in Europe will take them. But if they're about to drown in the ocean, we just let them die. And I started thinking about this and how did it work that way, that Australia, that is typically really a multicultural country that's proud, in its migration and opens the door to refugees to resettle in Australia according to agreements. I mean, how people are so, indifferent to that type of rescuing. I mean, these are, the actual refugees that are, all, about to die out there. And I thought, I agree with you that, describing, that Howard sentiment as clever, because, and really, if you look at public opinion polls, you see that 70% of Australians are happy to live in a diverse country and think that one of the best things about Australia is its multiculturalism, and yet 70% also think that both people should be sent back and not allowed in Australia, and there is something to reconcile here. And I think the problem is really the way that boat arrivals, refugees arriving by boat, have been just labeled as a threat in such a powerful and effective way that Australians tend to not see them anymore as refugees at all, which is a problem. And the opposition is now already also so much kind of believing in this narrative as well that it's just impossible almost to break this almost consensus, which is a false consensus that was based, on kind of, poor politics, effective though. And I think this is really the essence of it, because instead of using that terminology and these labels, what we need to do is to portray those people as who they really are, which is people who are escaping mortal danger that needs our protection right now. And it does not necessarily mean that they will stay here forever. Perhaps they will be then resettled in another country in accordance with the UN scheme. And so what can be done around this problem, I think really the opposition here should be, and not just the opposition, I think Australians and different communities should be much more proactive about creating dialogues, because I think right now the polarization is actually going against what we're trying to achieve, which is really kind of making people just entrenched in their own original position and then buy into that narrative. And some of the things that I show in my research basically is that the way that this narrative, like the threat narrative, has been developed is that the way that we responded to it from the human rights community actually strengthened it, because we use the same type of narratives to oppose it perhaps, but when we say no, they're not criminals, no, they're not terrorists, we're actually basically entrenching that general perspective in society that, yeah, you know, there is a security threat around you, and that's why the debate is around the threat and the threat level and how much threat, and is the threat real or is the threat just, you know, a minor threat? And so ultimately we just need to completely, you know, let this narrative go and focus and, you know, offer something else, something fresh from our own.
Thanks. So very quickly on bipartisanship, I think the better way to understand it's not sort of good or bad in and of itself inherently. It depends what it's about. So the bipartisanship, why I raised it was very particular. It was in the context that there has been a bipartisanship in this country, which in the past, which actually was about something quite different, and that was a bipartisanship which accepted refugees into this country, and that both major political parties, as an act of leadership, agreed to not play the politics of fear, but the opposite. So this is in the 1970s and 1980s. And it is quite clear that there was an opening. This is with Indo-Chinese refugees in that period. It's quite clear that if that there were public anxieties and fears about people coming by boat to Australia, and it's quite clear that the opposition at the time decided not to play into those fears, but the opposite, and joined with the government at the time that had decided to show an act of leadership to again not play into those fears, but rather to do the opposite. And I think there's pretty settled history. Some may think there is no such thing as settled history, but the history that I understand is that actually bipartisanship was crucial in Australia, acting in a humanitarian way, which resulted in 177,000 Indo-Chinese refugees being flown in. They didn't even have to get on a boat; they were flown in. And it's one of the golden threads of our modern history, that fact, and with almost no inflaming of political fear and anxiety because of, I think a central aspect of that was the bipartisanship. So that's what I mean by bipartisanship, that kind of bipartisanship, not the opposite, which we've seen. And I accept that there has been, as Greg mentioned, as you mentioned, a different kind of bipartisanship, but that's what I mean. I don't want to get into semantics, but I don't think it's right to say that there is no such thing as good bipartisanship. I also don't, I'll add one thing to it, and that is I think that in answer to your position that if we had a strong opposition putting a different narrative on this, that somehow that could be an answer to the harm that we've seen. I'm actually not convinced by that. I actually think the politics of fear is so powerful that it is a very difficult thing to defend, and I think the history of this is such. I think history matters, and I think the politics of fear, when it sets in this area, is one that is very difficult to combat. I'm not suggesting one shouldn't try. I do so every day. Many others in this room do, but I think for a political party at the moment in this country, a major political party, I agree with you that they should do it, but I think it's very difficult if you have a government or an opposition, whichever it is doing it, that play the politics of fear. I think it's a very difficult thing to strike good policy in this country on this issue. I just think it ends up descending into what we've seen. It's more likely to. So I think that's the history. Look, we don't have time, I know, for all of the other issues. Max, not for the first time you've raised a very important legal point. Your question is actually a call to arms to bring a case. So, and keep calling to arms to lawyers, and hopefully one day that case will be brought. Because really what the case that you're calling us to bring is a case that once again is another angle on how to bring into the law the question of the harm that's been done and how to address it or redress it. And because what's happened is, in many respects, the obligations we've signed up to under international law, and indeed obligations that exist under Australian law in different areas, have been undermined fundamentally. And that's we have taken the law out of the law in this country. And so your suggestion is really about trying to address it through legal means. And all string to your arm, and hopefully you'll get some of us bringing a case one day. So I think that's that. And then very quickly, I just wanted to find one final point. it's on the delays on processing in Australia, and it is one of, I have to say, in all the public forums that I speak at with others, it is one of the enduring concerns in the Australian public is why does it take so long to process claims of people seeking asylum? And the fact is, I can tell you, my agency at the moment, we help literally thousands of people every year going through this process, and many people who have what, in our view, are strong arguable cases that haven't yet been decided, that have a case, have been waiting in our community, sometimes having lodged their case for more than 2 years for an interview from the department after lodging their case, sometimes much more than that. And there are huge problems with that. There are multiple reasons for that, lack of resourcing to do the claims. There are potentially other issues surrounding it, perhaps bureaucratic dysfunction. There may be other reasons on top of it. We don't have time to go through all of them, but it is a big problem that needs to be addressed. I do want to add one final point, if I can sneak it in. Tasman referred to the Scanlon reports, the Mapping Social Cohesion reports, which are issued each year, and I commend you to read them if you haven't, those reports. There's another really fascinating statistic, and it's been a constant roughly over the last decade, and it is it's a very particular question, so I'll just frame the question because it won't make any sense otherwise. The question is really about public support for the resettlement program, that is bringing refugees to Australia under the resettlement program. And broadly speaking, public support has shown roughly about 80% support for the program, that is when we bring refugees to Australia. I don't know what other social issue in Australia attracts 80% public support, but there's not many, I would suggest. There is very strong public support for a program of resettling refugees, bringing them in. I think part of the dialogue that we need to have in this country, what I call a proper dialogue, a real and proper dialogue, needs to ask the question, are we really a nation divided on refugees, which is, I think, what's often presented. I would say we're actually not if the question is reimagined, and the question is simply this: are we a nation fundamentally committed to the principle of refugees coming here? So are we a nation fundamentally committed to the principle of refugees coming here? There may well be a diversity of opinions over how many, how they should come, where they should come from. They are questions to be addressed, and they're very important questions. But on that fundamental principle, it seems to me that there is a very strong public support, and it's on that basis, it's on that foundation, rather than on boats, rather than on a whole range of other associated issues, how people arrive, etc. But on that fundamental principle, I think that's where the proper dialogue needs to start, on that foundational principle. And if we do so, I think that therein lies a better approach, a far better approach, and one that actually honours that generosity of spirit that I think is a driving generosity of spirit across the nation on the question of refugees, but one that has been poisoned by toxic politics. It's been poisoned by the question of boats, and it's been poisoned by a whole range of a political dynamic which has sought to characterise people with problems as people who are a problem, and rather than as people who are seeking our help and who we have a grand history of actually helping. And
thank you, David. Thank you all. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, I just want to make a couple of announcements. This is, as you can see, a two-part movie, and we finish without the story being complete, so we'll have to come back to this. This is a series of policy forums. We'll let the government and the opposition get their policies sorted out. In a few months, we'll come back to some of these issues. We'll have 4 of these forums this year. We'll finish up at the end of the year in November with a policy forum looking at authoritarian populism, because we have a large conference coming up on that theme. We'll pick up on the issue of reconciliation and First Nations peoples, which we didn't get to properly tonight. Later in the year, as I said, we'll see what the government policies are, see what the opposition policies are, and engage with this question that our panel has put to us. Australians are better than this. We do support the idea of migration in general and refugees in particular. how do we get better policy from all parties in government on this? Please join me in thanking the panel.